Most of us absolutely dread difficult feedback conversations. Why? Well, because humans as a species are conflict averse generally. And we're all afraid of being accused of bullying or not valuing diversity and just not being politically correct. And we've been brought up as children with, if you've got nothing nice to say, keep quiet. So you can start to see why some of these really tough feedback conversations we don't relish. So what goes wrong? Well, number one, lack of trust. Reciprocity is a strong social dynamic and we mirror back what we get. So if we feel attacked, we'll attack. And for successful feedback to happen, learners have got to make themselves vulnerable, and most of our learners just don't trust their trainers enough to allow that. We often talk about formative assessment, and that's feedback, and we probably need to move away from that because assessment is all tied up with high stakes exams. And I suppose we have to remember that trust is earned, it doesn't just happen. And as trainers, we need to work on that, dig our well before we're thirsty, and make sure that we've built trusting relationships with our trainees. Another problem is lack of clarity. We often focus on vague judgments and no real clear examples. And we've talked quite a lot about capturing clear examples whenever we have anything to do with a trainee, anything that is either excellent or worrying. Make a note of the examples, not our judgment of it, but the actual words. Because one of the difficulties is that if there's a big gap between our view of a trainee's performance and their view of their own performance, they'll look for ways of dissing you and your opinion. Another problem is listening, lack of listening. We tend to assume that persuasion is about speaking rather than listening. So we tend to go on transmit rather than receive, particularly when we're anxious. Listening really matters when we're stuck. And of course, that's the hardest time to do it. And we often use it as a last resort. And generally, when we're having a conversation under pressure, we're thinking about what we're going to say next rather than what the other person is actually saying. And then finally, lack of skill. We've just not learned how to handle it. And many of us resort to that rather well-trodden path, the shit sandwich. Or the feedback sandwich, it's more politely called, where you give a compliment and then you criticise and then give another compliment, which often gives the trainee a false sense of how they're doing. So 2 positives and a negative, and they take that to mean that they're doing okay. Often they'll focus on the last thing they hear in a sequence as well, particularly if they lack insight. And for those that do have insight, any praise is likely to come across as rather contrived and insincere. Now, it's important to remember that feedback doesn't have to be delivered flawlessly, but the person getting it must feel that you've got their best interests at heart. Back to those lacking insight. Now, we've talked about these people, and some of the most challenging are those who are experiencing the Dunning-Kruger effect, that cognitive bias where people overestimate their capability in a specific area. And this tends to happen because of a lack of awareness, which prevents them from accurately assessing their own skills. So, for example, doing a couple of DHSs as an assistant does not mean that someone can carry on unsupervised. I know you know that, but how do you make sure your learners know and understand that too? Now, I want to introduce you to the concept of radical candour. And there are 2 dimensions to radical candour. There's one dimension that is around challenging trainees very directly and being willing to piss people off. And then this other dimension, which is about caring personally. Now, we often see one dimension used to the detriment of the others. It might be this one, the caring personally one, where there's loads of care and preserving a relationship at all costs, including the cost of integrity. And I see a lot of people doing that, particularly when they get anxious about hurting somebody or anxious about being considered a bully. So that ruinous empathy is no good. Or those that challenge directly, feeling that they're being very, very direct and very clear. And actually, they've left their kindness at home, which just becomes either bullying or obnoxious aggression. So that's no good either. So too much of one or the other, inappropriate place, doesn't work. And maybe even worse, the worst of both worlds are those that just avoid or stab in the back, as it were, talk behind somebody's back. So getting the balance right is called radical candor. And that's where the appropriate challenge and the appropriate care and kindness is used to underpin whatever interaction you have with this individual needing some difficult feedback. And constantly reviewing and rebalancing to get that right is the key to this radical candor. What else can we do? Well, there's another 5 things we'll think about. And number 1 is to separate the person from the problem. Focus on the trainee's performance, not their personality. Examples of things you've seen, not generalisation like you are lazy or you are sloppy. It's sometimes worth going for what's called unconditional positive regard. Try only allowing yourself to think or talk positively about your trainee, particularly if they're on a bit of a downward spiral and are irritating. So only allow yourself to think or talk positively about the person, and anything that doesn't fit with that, take up properly with them. Number 2, prepare. Begin by clarifying what you want to achieve at the end of the conversation. I normally script out the beginning and the end, and I try to anticipate how the discussion might go, how it might be received, along with how I'm going to handle my reactions to any of those responses. Number 3, watch your words. Starting or ending a conversation with "don't take it personally" isn't right, really. Of course they're going to take it personally, and so they should. It's their personal feedback. That's a little bit like "with all due respect." You know when somebody says "with all due respect," they're about to be heartily disrespectful. So try words like "I'm concerned about," "I noticed," "I'm wondering." What's the likelihood of you doing this, and by when? And then conversation extenders like, "really? Tell me more." Next, lean in to the feedback conversation and ask questions. And I always remind myself to ask questions just when I don't want to, just when I want to end the conversation, just when I want to run away. That's just when I need to ask questions. So be quiet. Move from blame to dual contribution, from being sure you're right to finding out what the trainee's thinking. And if it's different, ask the question, "I wonder why we're seeing this so differently." Understanding your trainee doesn't mean that you agree with them. And then finally, practice. Just like reducing a fracture or putting on a cast or doing an operation doesn't just happen overnight. You have to learn how to do it. And we're back to that reflection on action to learn how to do it. Every time you have a difficult conversation, just make a few notes afterwards, a few reflective notes. What worked? What didn't work? What might you do next time? What were you thinking whilst it was going on? The more you learn how to reflect on action, the more likely you are to be able to reflect in action. so that when you're having one of these conversations, you know which of those radical candor vectors to press, if you like. So do you need to challenge more, or do you need to show more care personally? Let's use some of those principles to practice on our scenarios tomorrow evening. See you then.